Can you hear me now? You could hear me anyway, but I wasn't recorded. Ooh, okay. Yeah, so some of you, sometimes discussions proceed that way. You have a thought, you'd like to say something, and then the conversation, goes in another direction, and you kind of suspend that. So some of you, I'm sure, during the sessions today and yesterday may have had questions which you didn't ask. So my role here then will be to simply to kind of not manage, but to coordinate the asking of questions or answering questions for that matter. I'm not going to answer questions. I have no intention of summing up all of the presentations that have been given. I think or have been made. I think the panel chairs did an excellent job of kind of mobilizing the discussion and organizing things in a certain way, so that you got to express your thoughts and opinions about these issues. But there's still things to discuss. I mean, just looking at my own notes of the sessions, I'm thinking, well, as a teacher, and the title of this conference is, after all, Learning from Learners, what do teachers learn about this? And I don't mean only those in the room who are officially, statutorily teachers, but several students here have already had experience as teachers, or they have done research on teaching learning processes, and have their own experiences about what it is to be someone, in a sense, responsible for mobilizing a certain process of intellectual engagement and what we call learning, and perhaps even responsible for ensuring certain learning outcomes, or deciding whether students achieve those learning outcomes or not. As a faculty member and administrator, I'm on a lot of committees and boards which often have to really directly confront issues of learning outcomes, because as much as we might like to see see higher education as a kind of process of ADA, and that was the first time I'd heard ADA defined as inoperativity, but I like that. I like that description. We, after all, operate as teachers and learners in institutions which provide credentials, right? None of us probably, as a learner, is just so in love and thoroughly satisfied with what they do that they're willing just to pay money, either a little money or a lot of money, and not get something called a degree at the end, right? We're all part of that degree granting or degree earning scheme, and whether we're looking at to simplify things, the Humboldtian model of education of self-perfection, self-cultivation without any particular outcome or object or training for a particular profession, or whether we look at the so-called Napoleonic model of education being utilitarian, to produce a certain number of people to do certain kinds of jobs. We do depend on we do have our credentials, we seek credentials, and the credentials are supposed to be some meaningful measure of what it is that we've learned. And although what I just said a few moments ago about determining learning outcomes or identifying learning outcomes is really at a very kind of elementary stage, it is, that is in terms of that, it's a kind of conceptualization or an imagining of how those outcomes might be achieved. This is something that educators and education administrators are always concerned about. Probably our best experiences as learners and teachers have been when we've had very far-ranging, free-flowing discussions where we've, if not exactly ripped up the syllabus, we've said, oh, it doesn't matter, at least today or this week, right? We'll forget what the examination is, or what this course, what this class was supposed to be about today. So many interesting things have come up in the course of a discussion or engagement between, among the students and between teachers and learners and so on, that we'll just go with it. So a lot of, anyway, I'm sorry if that seems like a digression, but the reason I mentioned that is that so many of the reflections and observations that have been offered in the presentations we heard today and yesterday, and specifically those that deal with the use of information and communication technologies, turn around this question of to what extent ICT can make the learning experience either more applied, more outcome-oriented, or on the other hand, more flexible and open-ended. Whether perhaps information and communication technologies can, as some of you explicitly said in your presentations, whether it's good to imagine ICT as something replacing the traditional role of the teacher, or, and particularly in situations where there are, in some cases, literally no teachers present, right? No one there in the classroom, or not enough teachers to manage the learning process for large numbers of students. That's obviously one kind of quick fix or rather ICT is sometimes kind of shallowly imagined as a quick fix to that kind of situation. But without trivializing that, obviously in a country like India, as well as in many other countries, the sheer issue of numbers and reach and extending the higher education experience to larger numbers of the population is certainly an issue and can't be trivialized. But so ICT is often imagined as something that will solve quantitative problems, but there are also ways in which ICT is imagined to deal with qualitative issues also. Again, whether ICT can enrich the learning experience, whether it can help teachers or learning managers or whatever you want to call them deal with different levels of engagement and involvement and participation on the part of students, and perhaps bridge some of the gaps that some of you have been speaking about. Whether, again, ICT can augment the formal teaching process by allowing students to interact with each other outside of classroom spaces, as well as in addition to their interactions in classroom spaces, and also whether there are particular assessments or evaluative activities which might be done through a certain technological platform rather than the kind of the old-fashioned assessment of sitting and taking examinations, sitting in a room and sweating and writing for hours and hours. Anyway, again, not to seem, I hope this doesn't seem terribly personal or egotistical, but again, as a teacher, I wonder what all of this means for the quote-unquote traditional teacher-student relationship. Certainly some teachers, perhaps myself included, are so bad at some times that probably removing us from the scene might be a good thing. All of us, even those of us who are teachers, can remember particularly uninspiring or ineffective teachers. But I don't think anyone seriously proposes removing the teacher from the scene entirely. But just again, looking at my notes and some of the phrases that jump out from my notes taken from some of your presentations, the idea of teacher as technician or teacher as observer in her own space. What kind of observing is happening when one is using, when students and when learners and teachers are interacting in something like Google Classroom or Blackboard, where it's true, it's possible to monitor and keep track of and in fact facilitate certain kinds of interaction that can't happen or cannot only happen in a physical space like a classroom. Certainly there are interesting things that can happen and can be nevertheless monitored, and I don't mean monitored in a way that involves some kind of disciplining or anything, but rather to take stock of or to be aware of certain learning interactions. On the other hand, to think of a teacher as an observer, to be, I would say, teacher as merely observer in his or her own space is something that probably very few students would really want to have either, because after all, that would simply be a kind of formalization of what is in fact already happening in some situations. I'm trying to remember who it was yesterday who talked about actually attending only 2 hours of classes per week in his college because teachers simply were not there. Even if that's not the typical experience for most of you, and I hope it's not, the complete retreat of the teacher from the classroom is probably not something that anyone imagines as really a desirable outcome or something that would really improve higher education or would really enrich the learning experience. In spite of what it is that can be done through MOOCs and online courses and so on, where certain evaluative processes can be done, remotely and indirectly and so on. So many different things came up today, and again, I've already talked more than I intended to. It's not possible to really summarize the richness of what transpired today and yesterday in these sessions. Some of the presentations were really quite focused on the topic, others less so, but it wasn't that the ones that were focused on their topics were necessarily better than the kind of wandering ones. Many of them were quite interesting for different reasons. Again, this particular Project Equal, on a kind of instrumental level, is really about rethinking or thinking creatively about information and communication technologies, and again, how these might augment rather than replace teachers, how they might help alleviate some of the access problems that students in India and other countries face. And we mean access not only in terms of whether one has the opportunity to step inside a college or university or not, but rather once one is there, what kind of learning interactions are possible. In this project, we have at fairly early on decided that we weren't going to talk about new learning technologies in terms of distance learning specifically, but rather we would look at new learning technologies within the traditional, physical face-to-face learning setup. Therefore, in terms of what's often described as blended learning. People who have written about this or have studied the effectiveness or even the assumptions behind blended learning have found it difficult to really kind of confine themselves to looking at a kind of limited application of those technologies, because the technologies themselves are evolving in very rapid ways. They're becoming more sensitive in terms of the kinds of interaction or interactivity that can be allowed or that can be activated. So the more pessimistic education technologists, or I'm sorry, not education technologists, but education administrators do actually foresee the development of ICT, meaning the cutting down of faculty lists. As Mansi was already saying, the reduction of the faculty as a workforce, or rather the ability of the faculty as a workforce to serve the needs of expanding numbers of students. That's again probably not the reason why we as teachers would at least have some interest in new education technologies. We want to see ourselves not being supplanted, but rather see our activities being, again, augmented, or somehow new dimensions of learning being enabled. At the same time, I was just kind of late in the afternoon yesterday, I was thinking about an American colleague of mine, a historian, who says that he encourages his students to use Wikipedia, not in preparing term papers, but in terms of just getting becoming familiar with certain issues and so on, with the understanding, of course, that that is the first step, or that is a start, and that, of course, every good Wikipedia article should provide some kind of venue, or rather some kind of way out or way forward that would involve, we would hope, engagement with more substantial material and so on. There was a famous, quite influential essay written about 7 or 8 years ago by a man named Nicholas Carr, with the very engaging title, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And his answer is yes. He believes that the search capacity of Google actually allows us to make connections too quickly without really giving us the ability to sustain or make very much out of those connections. Again, it's something that's been contested. Many people have tried to demonstrate just the opposite. But although again, this was published in the Atlantic Monthly in July 2008, so in terms of the evolution of new learning technology, it's really almost dealing with the infancy of the science of new communication or new learning technology. But I think the question is still a relevant one. Several contributors today and yesterday have again dealt with the issue of e-books, which would of course simply be taking something that is in a traditional medium, digitalizing it, perhaps making it cheaper, although even there the question is it really being made cheaper, because those e-books are still being consumed by means of electricity and servers, and whether one is using a personal device or a shared device or whatever. In terms of the total cost of delivering it, it's not necessarily cheaper, but it may be cheaper in one sense to a consumer, however the consumer is understood. One would still ask then, is it only about providing newer or better or cheaper learning materials, and then letting the process of well, in the most mechanical terms, assessment take care of itself? I think one question I had about many of the presentations today, and even in other conferences like this that I attend, is, well, is it really just about providing better material and assuming that students will immediately know how to make the most of it? And if the process of assessment, that is judging or assessing how it is, how much they've learned and in what way they've learned it, is still very traditional in terms of putting pen to paper, then what have these new media actually accomplished? Anyway, there were several very interesting presentations, and so many different issues were raised. Many of the answers that the presenters were allowed to give were, of course, only partial and so on. So as I'm whittering on and on here, I'm still thinking that there may be a few people out there who have some questions burning at the back of their minds, which they didn't ask maybe earlier today, or a question they didn't ask one of the presenters yesterday. So I will finish up by asking, again, inviting you to either ask a question directly related, or something that comes to mind as a result of something you heard yesterday or today. Yes?
answer, if somebody is asking a question, if the house answers back first, give a chance to the house to answer that question back. Maybe that's another point came from my mind. Yes. Can I add, sir, can I add one more?
Yes, certainly.
Vocational studies, it might happen that India might have 80% requirement in the future for vocational studies. Just a point. Vocational studies.
Is that a kind of prediction that at some point
we may require? Yeah.
We may require. Yeah. Who's to decide what is required?
That's the international standards. Maybe the Americans 70%, 80% don't graduate. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe, but they do not graduate after school. They work. Europeans, or I don't know. That's the point.
Suresh, you had.
Well, partly because our session had to be rushed through the technical session. There were a couple of questions that I had in mind, but one was a very general question, which I thought at least would be partly sort of something I'll be able to make of it. During the conference, I was not able to sort of get a sense of how many of you actually use some of these, are users of the classrooms which have got various, I'm not saying PPTs, but MOOCs or whatever is going on in the universities, and your experiences about them. I just wanted to hear some voices on that. Actually, using these things, is it helping? Is it really revolutionary in that sense, or what? Is it just supplementary of some kind? I mean, I really wanted to know, which is something I sort of couldn't sense from a lot of chatter we had on the sides either. Thank you. If any of you want to respond to that.
Just one point regarding Suresh has a very, very relevant question. Just one point I want to add. I can't really answer your question in a holistic manner. Interestingly, a friend of mine says that the MOOCs are extremely useful to him, not to learn a subject, but when he's making a presentation on a sub-subject, which is to say, if there is a particular area of history on which he has to make a presentation, he basically registers himself into this course, attends 2 or 3 classes, and after that he gets the gist. So in terms of depth, he's not really reliant on MOOCs, but in terms of having the extract from particular learning material, it's quite useful.
So that's interesting. Is it a content aggregator then, or is it something which you might just by looking at a MOOC at random, or say something on a MOOC on a particular subject, find something which is relevant to what you're doing? Is that the idea? Or
I think when you have a basic knowledge of any subject and then you use
a way that I had never had before. So the MOOCs, as Shomukda says, they're like aggregators. So if you already have a basic knowledge, they're used for efficiency purposes. Khan Academy, they keep a track of your sort of like modules, so they're a little bit better, but because there's no communitarian engagement as such, because you still personalize and individualize your learning, which is in any digital learning format. If you can decide when and how you want to learn, chances are that most students will not learn. It is like an established fact that the failure rate of MOOCs and Khan Academy is huge. So unless you are accountable to somebody else to learn, and unless you yourself construct the learning, you will probably not learn from digital media.
Something more on the tools, for instance, Moodle vis-a-vis Blackboard, vis-a-vis other things. Any reflections on those tools per se as learning tools?
we'll just take the questions here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a second year student, and in my first year, we were exposed to a compulsory course, which was compulsory for every first year that came through to our college. It was an ethics course which was taken by 2 of our professors, and told us about basic university life and how we're supposed to attend classes and not plagiarize, and what were the rules and regulations. So it was purely an online course. So our teachers used to upload lectures to this website, and we were supposed to watch and respond, and assignments were given. Not assignments in the conventional sense, but maybe they used to hold a discussion forum, and we were supposed to reply with proper arguments and take sides and hold debates, but it was all online. So like one of my colleagues mentioned yesterday, when it comes to a purely online course, people generally do not work for it as much as it is required in face-to-face learning. We basically fulfill the minimum requirement as and when if it's mentioned that you're supposed to make one argument in this favor, nobody will work hard to prove themselves to the entire forum that yes, my argument is correct. They will sometimes just agree with the previous argument or leave something which vaguely corresponds to what has been told already before. But another course which was taught in a somewhat similar manner was academic writing, which was hybrid. Now these people had one online class, two online classes plus one face-to-face interaction every week. So with that, people were forced to, there was a somewhat pressure of facing this teacher and realizing and their constructive argument in a classroom paradigm, which turned out to be much more successful than the course which is purely online. So when it comes to digitization, I somewhat support a more hybrid approach rather than a complete online hybridization of any course.
And one specific point you're making is that the kind of agreement which might appear in a, say, Blackboard or something is often a kind of lazy consensus,
Yes,
or a minimal one, rather than something that is
Something
defended?
that's much
or
more constructive and face-to-face, which is where peer-to-peer review and everything are found really effective.
Okay. Maybe I'll move over here to this side and then come back. Yes, in the back there, green shirt.
One thing that I find a little bit surprising is that nobody's talked about how using ICT and things like MOOCs can actually augment learning form in art. And it's strange where if you have, for example, a book on music, then unless you're already fluent in being able to read it, you're not going to get any benefit from that. Whereas if you have something like a Coursera course, which is about the introduction to Bach, then you're going to have the opportunity to keep on trying to teach yourself right from that in the absence of a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of thing applies not just to music as well, it applies to film, and it applies to different art forms. So I've taken a couple of those, and that's why it's worth throwing in that.
Well, so I know you have questions, but just in response to that, I think one question that the people involved in this project have asked each other sometime is, why don't we just use all the great stuff that's on the net and design courses around them, right? We talk about customizing, maybe adding some content, particular things that are adapted to our particular visions of what should be learned, but there is a lot of good stuff out there, and as you've just pointed out, in terms of teaching yourself about something that you're really interested in, Coursera or something like that might be quite effective, but perhaps there's a disconnect between that process of learning, self-study or whatever, and what it is that you're forced to do, again, not to be too cynical, but in order to get that credential, a degree, BA, MA, whatever. How do we bridge this divide? I mean, do you think teachers should be, or that teachers generally should be more appreciative or respectful of what is already out there in often commercially packaged form, Coursera, something like that? Or should we be trying to come up with our own content packages that relate to the teaching that we're required to do? I mean, it's maybe not something that has an obvious, an immediate answer, but again, there's some really wonderful stuff out there, and maybe teachers should be making better use of it. On the other hand, some of it's terrible, right? So, is our function then to correct that, or to perhaps see in what ways, students' understanding of particular issues may be, over-determined or, negatively influenced by that kind of material. But where does the teacher's role in that begin and end?
And I think what you said about self-study and voluntarism in acquisition of knowledge really plays a huge role in the success of these sorts of resources. But they can also be used as appendages to already existing commercially packaged courses. And I think that that's been talked about a little bit.
Right, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I would just like to disagree with the notion that MOOC cannot teach you something from scratch. I think that depends on how the MOOC is designed. And as far as the fact that, you have to depend on your own enthusiasm and your own ability to commit to the MOOC and keep up with it, that's of course there. If you drop out of the MOOC or you lose interest, you will. And there's nothing, I don't think there's anything a MOOC can do about that. That falls on your own accountability. But there's a very famous Harvard MOOC called the CS50. That's the Intro to Computer Science. Is anyone familiar with CS50? A lot of people take CS50, and it's very popular because A, it's taught very well, and B, it involves a lot of community interaction. So because it's very popular, it's, people all over the world take it every single year. There are Facebook groups for individual localities. There are meetups in cities. So Delhi has a CS50 meetup. Mumbai has a CS50 meetup. And these are officially, semi-officially monitored by Harvard in some form. And so the community aspect is still there. You're still learning with peers. You're accountable to your peers in some sort of way. So that's there. And it basically teaches you computer science from scratch, from knowing nothing rather than how to turn on the computer. And it's very successful. People take it and people go on to do jobs in the industry. And it doesn't teach, and it's not a simple vocational thing. Computer science is not a vocation. It teaches you computer science. And I think it's very successful, and a lot of people have learned a lot from it from scratch. So I think that generalizing all MOOCs as not being able to teach you something from scratch, and rather than only augmenting knowledge, is perhaps being too harsh.
Yeah, well, again, what's often observed about MOOCs is the dropout rate. I mean, those that are able to monitor who's participating and so on. And apparently there are very few people who go all the way to the end. Now, whether that's actually a measure of failure, I'm not sure. Because again, if a credential or a particular certificate is not really what you're there for, but rather to learn, a series of things in order to, enrich your understanding of something, which you can then, bring over to some other part of your learning experience, then whether or not you finish the MOOC is perhaps not the issue. Yeah. There were a couple other hands up on this side of the room. Yes.
I just want to make a comment about I've taken a lot of courses on Coursera, and I use Yale courses very often, and I want to make a comment regarding how the stylistics of the videos themselves. In Coursera, sometimes what happens is a lot of professors, or a lot of instructors, when they're instructing, they're very awkward in front of the camera. They don't know how to represent themselves, and they don't know how to talk, and they get really, really freaked out. And that is very natural. But in Yale courses, what happens is that the professor is just taking a regular class, and he's being filmed while he's taking it, or she's taking it. So they're not really absolutely conscious that they're being filmed. And so what happens is that they end up teaching better courses, and their lectures are much more effective. Whereas in Coursera, they're just really, really awkward and stutter and are boring. So I think the stylistics of that is very important.
Yeah, that's interesting. It raises the question of whether self-consciousness on the part of the teacher is really going to help them or not, because I've heard that, well, I personally, in situations, find where I'm being filmed or something, I tend to get a bit self-conscious. On the other hand, if I were being filmed and recorded all the time, I would get used to it. Whether my teaching would be better because of that, I don't know. But there are people who've conducted studies of, you know, again, teachers and learners in a particular environment where everything is recorded and filmed, and whether that, you know, encourages a kind of spontaneity or naturalness, or kind of gets in the way of that. I think it's an interesting question. But yeah, I mean, often some of these, you know, again, if you look at some of the very well produced, you know, lectures of, say, professors at Harvard, Michael Sandel or something, yes, I mean, he just seems like he should get the Academy Award or something. I mean, he seems very natural and so on. And I know him slightly, so I mean, he's generally like that. Yeah, sometimes the technology itself, or the means of you know, recording and communicating that particular content can get in the way of the content in some ways. So, I mean, it can be just as distracting as it is enabling. A couple other people had their hands up earlier. I mean, no one's forced to ask anything or say anything, and you may be all tapped out, but. Okay, well, if you don't have any more other observations, I would just like to say a few words of thanks. Again, I think we've thanked the official, the money men and women of this project who were with us in the inaugural session, and we're certainly appreciative of the support that we've gotten for this project. And I would also like to thank specifically the organizing committee, so Tanuj and Aravind and Dr. Suresh did a lot of work. And thanks to all of you. I would like to point out that there is going to be a survey questionnaire which is going to be sent to them by email, online. Okay, please do pay attention to that. We will really get a lot out of. It's not only that there's certain things we are required to report to our funders, but we will use your feedback, you know, your reply to the questionnaires, in fact, for a research project that we're working on. So there may be a follow-up to the questionnaire that you're sent that's part of this conference, and we'd really appreciate it if you submitted the questionnaire as soon as you can. So thank you. It was very interesting 2 days, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And this is the second of 4 AUD student conferences. So some of you may actually be participating in number 3 or 4 also. But thank you very much.